What's going on, everybody? It's Pastor Hassan. I'm the pastor of Thistletown Baptist Church in Rexdale. We're located in the west end of Toronto. And thanks for tuning in this morning. We're going to jump into the word here shortly, but before we do that, I just want to make you aware that we have resumed our in-person services every Sunday morning at 10:45 a.m., and we would love to have you with us. If you're here in town, we're really easy to find. We're just a block north of Finch on Kipling Avenue at 2534 Kipling Avenue. You can't miss us. We're right across the street from the police station. So yeah, please join us if you can. If you want more information about us as a church, you can check us out at thistletownbaptist.ca, which should be in the description below this video. Now, having gotten the preliminary stuff out of the way, I just want to let you know in advance that the text that we're going to be looking at this morning is a bit of a doozy. It's a tricky one. We're jumping into a really difficult passage of Scripture this morning. And it's not just difficult because there are things in this passage that are hard to understand. This passage is difficult because there are things in this passage that are clear even, but those things in so many ways run right up against much of what we're told in our world today is good and beneficial and right. And so I hope you got your Bibles this morning. We're going to check out this morning together 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at verse 2, and we'll work our way through verse 16. We're going to be looking at this passage that deals with gender roles, and authority. So I'll give you a second to find 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 to 16, and we'll read that together. As we think about gender roles, and authority, this text specifically deals with those things in the context of a local church. But the principles that we learn from this text have broader application beyond just what the church does when she's gathered together. So let's read this text and see what's happening, and then see how it applies to us. Reading from the English Standard Version again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning at verse 2. This is what God's word says. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for your word. And thank you so much for the opportunity just to open it and to see what you have to say to us in it. And I pray, Father, that the posture of my heart and the posture of the hearts of every believer who listens, every person who listens, would be to submit to your word and ultimately to your authority. And so help me to speak truthfully, help me to speak clearly and accurately in accord with what you've said. And I pray that by the power of the Spirit, you would empower me to, just stick to the script. And pray that you would honor yourself in that. Pray that you would honor the Lord Jesus Christ, that you would conform your people to his image, and that you would save lost people who right now are rebelling against you and your authority. So give us grace now as we hear the word. Help us to not just be hearers, but doers as well. We ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. So I guess almost about a year ago now, I bought this book for Kathy for Christmas, and I had intended to bring it with me. I messed around and forgot to do that. But it's a book that's called it's called Crowns, rather, and the subtitle or the little tagline that goes with it is Portraits of Black Women in Church Hats. And the reason that I got this book for Kathy is because I figured that she would be interested in it. I know my wife well enough to know the things that interest her and the things that don't. And so I got her this book thinking, oh yeah, she'll dig that. But also the lady on the front cover of the book happened to remind me of my grandmother a little bit, and so there was that piece of it. But the main reason that I got this book for Kathy is because I wanted to share with her a little slice of culture that was very familiar to me, but pretty foreign to her. And that's women wearing hats in church. For me, growing up, like, it was a staple. Like, you go to a black church in the U.S., and guarantee you there's going to be a gang of women rocking hats. Like, yeah, pretty decked out, nice looking hats. And my grandma, like, 99% of the time when she was at church, she had on a hat. And, I remember going through her closet. I'm pretty sure my mom still has some of them now, but my grandmother had a bunch of hats. And it was funny, like, looking at this book, Crowns, the author was talking at one point about how the women that were photographed for this book, so it's basically, it kind of chronicles a little bit of the history of where this comes from, but the bulk of the book is just pictures of these black women in church hats. And he said that, the author said at one point in the book that of the women that were photographed for this book, on average, these women owned 54 hats, like just to wear to church. And there was one lady, I can't remember if it's 305 or 350, but there was one of those two numbers, like 300 plus church hats. And you think to yourself, okay, what in the world is that about? Like, who needs that many hats? Like, what's the point? I'll tell you. What nowadays, for a lot of black women, is just sort of a part of cultural heritage or just a fashion statement, actually has biblical roots. Black women wearing hats in church has roots in the passage that we're going to look at this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And another piece of culture from this chapter that is probably, I'm going to say even most likely, foreign to all of us. And even if we don't understand exactly what's going on in this little piece of culture, that we're going to see. And even if we don't understand the specific practice that we see outlined in this text, what's most important is that we understand the principles behind the culture and the practice. I'm going to call this sermon this morning Head Coverings and Haircuts. And the main point of this text, if you don't catch anything else that is said, is this. When Christians get together to worship, there is to be a reinforcement and a reflection of God's good design for men and women. Let me say it more clearly. When Christian people get together to worship, they are to reflect and reinforce God's good design for men and women. And so what's going on, just to give you a little bit of the flow of the book of 1 Corinthians, in chapter 11 to 14, what Paul begins to do is to help the Corinthians learn how they ought to live with each other and function together as men and women when they get together corporately as a church. And so the big picture of the book of 1 Corinthians is Paul is instructing the Christians, these Christians, the Corinthians, on how they ought to live and love like Jesus in a world full of people who don't. And by the time he gets to chapter 11 to 14, he's dealing specifically with in-house issues, what they're to do when they're gathered together corporately. And Paul wants them to do that, to relate to one another, specifically as men and women in the church, in a way that they're building each other up and ultimately bringing glory to God. And we're going to look at this passage this morning in two parts. And in order for Christians to reflect and reinforce God's good design for men and women when we get together in our worship gatherings, number one, we need to reflect God-given authority. And then secondly, we need to reflect God-given dependence and differences. So reflect God-given authority and reflect God-given dependence and differences. So let's see what's going on here in verse 2. Starting there. In that verse, we get a little bit of a progress report for the Corinthians. I don't know if they still do that in school. They must. But back in the day, it was like you got a little, even before your report card came out, you got a little progress report where your teacher would let your parents know how you were doing in class, like just kind of giving a bit of an update. Here's some things they're doing well. Here's some things they need to work on. And Paul does that with the Corinthians and lets us know how they were doing in their life together as a church. Check out what he says in verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. And so Paul is saying, okay, on the whole, there's a sense in which the Corinthians are doing a really good job. They're doing some things really well. They remember Paul and they remember the things that he taught. Specifically, Paul talks about maintaining the traditions. And that's another way of saying that the Corinthians were sticking to the gospel. But they weren't just sticking to the gospel in the sense that, okay, these folks believe the right things. Like, believe it or not, by the grace of God, the Corinthians were actually doing a pretty good job in terms of living in light of the gospel. See, that's crucial. It's one thing to believe good stuff, but as believers, we're also called to live in light of that good stuff that we believe. We're to have right belief and right practice. We're to live our lives in a way that adorn the gospel well. And so Paul will say to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. He's planning on making a trip to Ephesus to see Timothy, check out what's going on with the brothers and sisters there. And he says, I hope to come to you soon, but I'm writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God. And when he says that, that's not about how Christians ought to behave in a building. That's about how Christians are to behave as a gathered community of people. And here Paul says the Corinthians were doing a pretty good job in that department. So they get a check mark in that sense. But then he offers them almost right away on the heels of that some constructive criticism. Look at what he says in verse 3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. So in verse 3, Paul begins to deal with a particular problem that had popped up in the Corinthian church, one of many. And this problem has to do with authority. Paul basically says everybody has a head. That's part of what it means to be a human being. To be a human being means that you have a head, and not just physically, like that much is obvious. But to be a human being is to have a head in the sense that you are under someone else's authority. Just let that sink in. Like by definition, as a human being, the way we are to function is we are under the authority of another. And I know for a lot of us that sounds all kinds of wrong, but just let's let the word speak here. When Paul says the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God, the word head here means authority. Like if someone is the head of the company, they're the authority. Like, or somebody's a head coach, like they have a certain amount of authority over the people that they are responsible for. But all of us are under authority. Everybody except God the Father is under someone else's authority. But the Corinthians, like so many of us, like they didn't really understand that. They didn't get that, or the fact that the proper authority that we see outlined in verse 3, like that's actually supposed to be reflected in their corporate gatherings as the people of God. It should be clear every time they get together that every man is under the authority of Christ. And it should be clear every time that they get together that every woman is under appropriate male headship. Daughters under their fathers. Wives under their husbands. Church members under elders. And before you say, well, hey, wait a minute, like that doesn't sound very fair, it kind of makes women sound like they're unequal to men, notice the last part of the verse. Verse 3. It says, the head of Christ is God. And that's important because it lets us know that this authority structure that should be reflected in the corporate gathering of God's people is not some outdated sexist idea that we should reject or ignore. But this is something that actually flows out of the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. In that relationship, if you think about it, there's equality in terms of their nature. So God the Father and God the Son are equally God. And yet, Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, willingly submits to the Father's authority. And so Jesus says in John chapter 5, verse 30, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Jesus is submitted to the will of the Father. And yet here's the thing. Jesus' equality with the Father is in no way diminished by his submission to the Father. And in the same way, a woman's submission to a man does not diminish her equality with men. It doesn't make her somehow unequal or less important. And in verses 4 to 6, we get an example of what this God-given authority structure should look like in the context of a local church. Let's read. Verses 4 and 5. It says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife or every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head was shaven. Now, without getting too deep into what Paul is talking about, I just want you to notice that he mentions prayer and prophesying. These two things that are happening in the course of the people of God getting together. And of course, prayer, we know, is talking to God. And that's just something that we expect. Whenever the church gets together, you go to a church service, you expect at some point, hopefully, like somebody's going to pray. There's going to be some praying that happens. But prophesying, that's a little bit different. Like, what is that? Well, again, without going into a long explanation, let me just say this. In this text, prophesying is not about somebody standing up and predicting the future. What it is, like, this is not like some ecstatic utterance, like somebody just sort of blacks out and then just starts talking about this and that. Prophecy or prophesying in this context is someone speaking something that's consistent with the truth of the gospel and doing it for the purpose of edifying the church. So it's standing up and giving a word that's consistent with the truth of the gospel. It's not out in left field somewhere, and it's for the purpose of edifying the church. And this verse says that men and women can do that. Men and women can pray and prophesy. See, the Bible is not anti-women participating or talking in church. It's not anti-women at all, but it does lay down appropriate ways for women and men to participate in the life of the church. And so Paul says, men and women pray and prophesy, but the way that they do it is different. A man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered, verse 4, or excuse me, with his head covered, verse 4 says, dishonors his head. But a woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Like, what's going on? Like, does that mean if a man stands up in church or sits down for that matter and prays or gives a word of encouragement, like wearing a hat, that he's doing something wrong? Or that if you're a lady and you don't wear a hat like my grandma did going to church every Sunday, and you try to participate in the life of the church, that you're somehow doing something wrong? That's not the point. The point is that God has given us this authority structure that is to be reflected and reinforced in the way that men and women participate in the life of the church. Men should do things in such a way that it honors Jesus, that shows off that they're under the authority of Christ. And so brothers, we don't ever want to do anything anywhere that would dishonor Christ, that would display that we're somehow men under our own authority. We are under the authority of Christ. And ladies, you don't want to conduct yourselves in a way that dishonors appropriate male leadership over you. And both of those things ultimately honor God, who is the ultimate authority over everybody. But these verses are specifically dealing with how men and women are to relate to each other. Verse 5 again. It says, every wife or woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head was shaven. Verse 6, for if a wife or a woman will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife or a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. In Paul's day, for a married woman to go anywhere in public without a head covering or a veil of some sort, it was pretty much like saying, like, I'm not under my husband's authority, which was to not only dishonor him, but it was to dishonor herself as well. The verse says it's the same as if her head were shaven, which is not talking about making a fashion statement or expressing yourself by what you do with your hair. And for the Corinthians, in their culture, for a woman to have a shaved head was a sign of shame and disgrace. And so the issue here is, what does your conduct as a man or a woman say about your relationship to God-given authority? Like, are you bringing honor to your head or shame? Or are you reflecting God's good design or refusing it? That's the issue. And again, before you dismiss this text saying like, okay, like that might have worked in the first century, but this is 2020, baby. We know better than that. Before you go there, notice verse 7 to 9. It says, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. This is interesting. This is what one author called a minefield of political incorrectness. Like, there's all kinds of stuff that anybody just about in our culture nowadays would hear and just sort of jump on and have all kinds of problems with. Even if we're honest, even for us as Christians, like, we hear that and some of us, like, the hairs on the back of our neck sort of stand up, like we sort of get all tense and we're not quite sure what to do. Something about the way so much of this text reads just doesn't sit well with us. But before you get all bent out of shape about the specifics, like, don't do that to the point where you miss the obvious. Again, these verses show that this authority structure that Paul is talking about is not something that he just sort of comes up with. It's not some outdated, archaic form of misogyny. No, it's something that flows out of the nature of God, and verse 7 and 9, it's built into the very creation. Verse 7 says, a man shouldn't cover his head, but a woman should, according to verse 6. So there's conduct that's appropriate for men and conduct that's appropriate for women. And what's that based off of? Where does that come from? According to verse 7, the reason a man shouldn't cover his head in worship is he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man, that same verse says. And that's amazing. And some of you ladies are thinking, wow, that's easy for you to say, you're a man. But just take that in, that this verse is saying that man is the image and glory of God. And don't misunderstand, Paul is no dummy. Like, this man knows the scripture. He knows Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Hold up. Male and female, he created them. This verse is not suggesting that only men are the image of God and women aren't. Paul is making a statement here about glory. And in this little section here, the word glory could also be translated honor, to give honor to. He's saying that men are created to honor God by recognizing and submitting to his authority. And you say, well, the same thing is true of women. Yes, but when it comes to how men and women relate to each other, which is what Paul is dealing with here, woman is the glory of man. That is, women are created to recognize, honor, and submit to the authority of men. Now, before you shut off your computer, start throwing things and just writing me off and writing off what I'm saying, verses 8 and 9 explain. What does it mean that woman is the glory of man? In verses 8 and 9, Paul begins to rehearse what happens in Genesis 2, verses 18 to 23, where God, he's created Adam, he's paraded all these animals in front of him, can't find a helper suitable for him. And so he makes a woman, equally created in the image of God, but she is the glory of man in what sense? Verse 8, she is made from him. God makes Eve from Adam's rib. But she's also the glory of man in that she's made for him. She's to be his helper. That's what we see in verse 9. And so a woman is equal in personhood and dignity, but distinct and different in terms of her role. You see, and this is important. God is communicating or was communicating something in the order of creation. This is not just random, like, oh, what does it matter? I'll make a dude first, and then I'll make a woman next. No, he's communicating something about authority, even in the creation order. Like, by making man first and making woman from man, God is not saying, okay, man is better and women are just sort of an afterthought. He's saying, no, there's authority built into the very way that things are created that is not the result of sin. And see, for a lot of us, in fact, I would argue in some ways, all of us, like we think that authority is bad in and of itself. It's automatically bad. But what the Bible suggests is that authority in and of itself is actually something that's created good. It's a good thing that comes from a good God. And see, where we end up running into problems as it relates to authority is that we rebel against legitimate authority, or we abuse authority. And that from the smallest of us all the way to the top. So you don't have to be some big CEO who's got money to blow and all kinds of stuff to throw around to abuse power. Like, people can have a little bit of power go to their head, and they can use it in ways that are not good and not helpful. That's what sin does. You see, whether you realize it or not, all of us have a problem with authority. You see, because all of our problems with authority, whether it's like not listening to our parents, feeling some type of way about the police, getting mouthy with teachers, you name it, any problem with authority that we have at the horizontal level results from the fact that we have a problem with authority at the vertical level. All of us by nature hate God's authority. We don't want God telling us what to do about anything. We don't want to be under authority. We want to be the authority. We all have a problem with authority. Even if you consider yourself like a law-abiding citizen, all of us are guilty of living in ways that rebel against the authority of the God who made us, who is the ultimate authority over everyone and everything. That's the problem. And God's response to this problem, what we earn for our rebellion against God and his authority is death. And that's the penalty for it. The wages of sin is death. But the good news of the gospel is that that's not the only outcome. The good news of the gospel is that God has sent his son Jesus into the world to save people who have a problem with authority. God has sent Jesus into the world, and unlike us who buck against God's authority, want to make ourselves the authority, do whatever we want, Jesus lived every day of his life in perfect submission to God's authority. Jesus never sinned. And yet he gave his life on the cross for people who do. Jesus hung his head, he bled and died in the place of people who shake their fist in God's face, so that, like, anybody who repents, turns from their sin, gives up rebelling against God, and trusts in Jesus, we can be forgiven and have life eternal. And see, people who trust in Jesus want to live to please him. And living to please Jesus is living in a way that pleases God. To live to please Jesus is to live in a way that pleases God. And what pleases God is when men and women reflect the authority structure that God himself has designed. When we reflect that in the way that we relate to one another. Verse 10. It says, that is why a wife or a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And honestly, like, this verse had me stumped. Like I have some speculation, read a bunch of commentaries, not really sure the exact meaning of this verse. But this much is clear, that there is a divinely structured order that needs to be uniquely displayed and maintained by men and women in the church. So in Paul's day, women wore head coverings of some sort, and men didn't. Which leads us to the last point. It's not just about appearance, although that's important. It's also about how we conduct ourselves as men and women. And so Christians should not only reflect God-given authority when it comes to our corporate worship together, but brothers and sisters, we should also reflect God-given dependence and differences. And just before we get into this next point, this last point, I want you to think about something. Like, what if someone were to ask you if God cares about how they dress or what they do with their hair? What would you say? Like, when you show up on a Sunday morning or just in general, does it matter to God what you wear, what you look like? Or to press it a little bit further, does it matter to God when, or what men look like and how men conduct themselves, or what women look like and how women conduct themselves? I'll let you think about that as we look at these last verses, verses 11 to 16. But you can see, I'm guessing, how this touches on like some pretty sensitive issues in our culture. And we definitely, as believers, we want to be sensitive even as we seek to be faithful to what God has said in his word. And so listen to what verse 11 says. It says, man is the image and glory of God. Nevertheless, verse 11, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. So lest men start to feel full of themselves for being men, as if you had a choice in the matter, Paul says, chill out, simmer down, and think about this. Women and men are mutually dependent on each other. Like we need each other. Like we can't do life without each other. That's a fact. Like if you're a married man, you need your wife. And obviously not in, I hope it's obvious, not in a absolute sense, but you need her in the sense that your wife is an indispensable part of your sanctification, your growth in godliness. That there are ways that only she can help you grow and be more like Christ, your Savior. You need your wife. She is the one who God uses to help keep you from thinking that life is all about you and what serves you. Think about it in the context of the church. Brothers, we need our sisters in Christ. We need them, and not just because, oh yeah, somebody's got to work in the nursery, somebody's got to teach the kids. No, but because like we need all of their gifts. Like the church is better and stronger because they are better and stronger in ways where we often lack. Like we need one another. And God is designed it that way. There's this mutual dependence. And the same thing is true for ladies. Ladies, please don't buy into this garbage that says, like, I don't need a man. Whoop-de-woo, whatever. So again, like in the absolute sense, do you need a man? No. Like if you are single to the day you die, you live your singleness to the glory of God. You do not need a man in that sense. But as a woman, by virtue of the way that God has created you and made the world to work, you need men. You need good, godly men in your life in particular. Whether that's a father or a brother by blood or by faith, or if the Lord gives you a husband or godly elders in a church, like God has designed you as a woman to need that. There is a mutual interdependence that exists between men and women. And as a church, we need to reflect that. And that needs to be clear in how we relate to one another when we get together. So it's not, the men really do all the important stuff and the women just do the leftovers. They kind of play the background, which ain't nothing wrong with playing the background, but let's not devalue the work that sisters bring to the table. We need each other. And that's the way that God has designed it. Paul argues from creation again in verse 12. He says, for as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. So listen, like Eve, the first woman, yes, was made from Adam. And God took one of his ribs, boom, popped out this beautiful, amazing woman. God did that. But with the exception of Adam, that God made from dirt, every other man who's ever been born came from a woman. So in that sense, in a very real sense, brothers, we owe our very existence to women. Like ultimately, we all owe our existence to God, but you get what I'm saying. Like there's this mutual interdependence, again, that we see. And all of this is from God. It's his idea. It ultimately is meant to reflect his authority. So back to my original question that I started this second point with. Does it matter what you wear to church and what you do with your hair? Yes. And no. No, in the sense that God is not checking to see who's got the freshest clothes on. He's not sort of scoping out congregations all over the world to see like who he needs to blow up with a lightning bolt because they're dressed improperly. He's not keeping an eye on people's hairstyle to see if they're doing it according to some divine code. You know, ladies need to wear this, dudes need to wear that. But God does care about how we look, what we wear, what we do with our hair, in this sense, that he cares about us displaying and guarding the God-given differences that he is built into the way men and women are to function. And not just to function, but to be. Like just by virtue of being man and woman. So God cares about us displaying and guarding the differences between men and women because those differences are his idea. It's built into the very way that he made creation. They are part of his good design. And so we live in a world nowadays that will tell you, oh, gender is fluid. It's a social construct. Like nobody outside of you can define you. You get to define who you are, which sounds like freedom. But the truth is it's rebellion against your ultimate authority, who is God. It's rebellion against a good and gracious God, not some God who is trying to keep you, trying to cramp your style and keep you from really being free and experiencing life. See, the truth is you can only experience freedom in terms of who you are when who you are is defined and shaped by the God who made you. Who you are is defined and shaped not by how you feel or what you think, but by what God says. That is what matters. Notice the text. Verses 13 and 15. Paul says, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife or a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Why should men and women function differently in the church? Verse 14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, verse 15, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering. And what Paul is saying here is that men and women are to function differently in the church because men and women are different. Like that's, again, built into the creation. And people know that by nature. Before you ever start talking about, how societies shape people and people's expectations and social constructs and all of that kind of stuff, there is something in us that knows men look a certain way and generally act a certain way. And the same thing is true of women. Women look a certain way and generally act a certain way. We know there are those expectations in terms of the differences between men and women. And what this text is saying is that when we get together as a church, we are to reflect that. We are to embrace that. Which just flies in the face of a culture and a world that in so many ways, more and more, is saying to us, like, nah, you can't do that. Like, that's hurtful, that's harmful. Like, that's going to cause more divisions and inequality if you do that sort of thing. And see, there's a real temptation for us as Christians living in that sort of culture with that sort of stuff floating around, for us to start to feel like, okay, if we're going to reflect and reinforce these God-given differences, like, oh man, like that's going to get us in trouble with the culture, or worse, we start to actually buy into that sort of thing, like, well, maybe they're right. Maybe, psychology and all of these different disciplines, maybe they figured something out in 2020 that God doesn't know. And we know better. But rather than going down that trail, brothers and sisters, we are to embrace these differences. We are to reflect the God-given differences and the God-given dependence that exists between men and women. And so we want to, in a world that's in so many ways working overtime to try to blur and confuse the lines between men and women, to sort of say, okay, you, never mind cultural expectations and all that, you get to define who you are however you feel. And just like we're expected to embrace that sort of thing. In that kind of world, what we're called to do is remember that no matter how culture changes, no matter what society we find ourselves in, no matter what generation it is, God's call for his people regarding these things is that men and women are to reflect and reinforce the differences between men and women that he himself has ordained. We shouldn't do anything that deliberately confuses or tries to get rid of those good distinctions. Nor should we try to do anything that would deliberately confuse or get rid of our dependence on one another. And I know it gets tricky whenever you start talking about, okay, can't do anything that would deliberately confuse the distinctions between men and women, how they should look and how they should act. It gets tricky when you start thinking through, okay, practically what does that look like? Does that mean like women can't have short hair? Like, does that mean like I shouldn't be wearing cornrows like I am now? Does that mean that women should wear hats or some kind of head covering every single time that the church gets together? But the thing that's true across cultures, across societies and generations is that we are to try, by the grace of God and the strength that he supplies, to honor God by submitting to him and to his authority and by keeping these clear distinctions between the genders. These God-given distinctions between genders and gender roles. That's what this text is teaching. That's the issue. And the passage closes like this in verse 16. Paul says, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. In other words, this is an authoritative word that ultimately comes from the authority of God. And so the question for you and for me is this: whose authority will we submit to? Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the way that it is so insightful, and it just perfectly diagnoses us as a people, us as individuals, us as a world, and what's wrong with us. But it doesn't just kind of poke at, oh, this is wrong, that's wrong, but rather it offers the only real solution to our deepest problems. And so we thank you, Father, for the gospel of your Son. We thank you, Father, that in Jesus there is hope for people who have a problem with authority, with your authority ultimately. We thank you for saving people and helping us to see the goodness of the way that you've designed things, and help us in a culture where things are becoming increasingly tense around a lot of these issues, that you would help us to be courageous and compassionate, and help us to live and love like Jesus in a world full of people who don't. We ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. All right. Catch y'all later. Have a good day. God bless.